E adesso finalmente veniamo alla Lectio Magistralis di Brian Richter, che chiamo qui a salire su questo podio. Brian Richter è presidente di Sustainable Waters, che è un'organizzazione che ha l'obiettivo di sviluppare la cultura dell'uso e della gestione della risorsa acqua. Richter, mi fa piacere che sia qui con noi e abbia accolto l'invito della Regione Emilia-Romagna. Ha svolto ricerche molto importanti e consulenze per le Nazioni Unite, come per anche comunità locali in ogni parte del mondo, promuovendo e partecipando in questo modo a più di oltre 120 progetti, se dico bene, progetti speciali. Insegna presso l'Università della Virginia e svolge ovviamente un'importante attività pubblicistica e di divulgazione scientifica, per cui per noi oggi terrà questa Lectio Magistralis in cui metterà in evidenza le soluzioni che possono essere attuate a fronte del problema della carenza idrica, e credo che sia il primo intervento dei nostri autorevoli ospiti stranieri che aiuterà a avviare il confronto delle buone policy e il confronto delle buone policy mondiali per il cambiamento climatico, per il climate change. Benvenuto, lascio a lei la parola.
Thank you very, very much. And this conference has been so inspiring and so informational. And so I want to just start by congratulating Franco Maria Ricci and Paolo Capretti for putting this agenda together. It has really, truly been very, very successful. And I also want to thank Patrizia Bianconi and Renzo Valloni and the entire staff of the Labirinto for all of the work that went into putting together this conference. So thank you. I'm going to start by sharing with you the idea that about 10 to 12,000 years ago, our relationship with water changed in a very, very fundamental way. What I mean by that is we shifted as human societies from being hunters and gatherers, and that included, by the way, not just going out and hunting for food, but going out and hunting and gathering water across the landscape, to making a very, very important decision to stay in place. We became sedentary, we became agricultural. And I say that was such a fundamental change in our relationship to water because instead of going out looking for water, we became very dependent and also vulnerable on that water coming to us. Now, of course, over time, we have used technology and engineering to change the amount of water that was coming to us, or at least the amount of water that we had available to us at any given time. So we built these large reservoirs. This is Hoover Dam on the Colorado River in the western United States. At the time in the 1930s when it was completed, was the largest reservoir in the entire world. Many, many larger reservoirs have been built since. But there are two reservoirs, main reservoirs on the Colorado River that can store 5 years of the flow of the Colorado River. And so that created a lot of opportunity for the growth of our societies and our economies and our communities in the western United States. Around World War II, of course, forever and ever, we had been going underground to search for water, to chase water as well, with hand-dug wells initially. But around the Second World War, we developed the capabilities, the technologies of industrial scale pumps. And that enabled us to go far underground, to go literally many, many meters, thousands of meters underground, and even to access water that had been deposited 10,000 years ago during the last ice age, ancient water that we were able to extract from under the ground. And of course we have, for more than 1,000 years, been moving water around and bringing it to us. Originally with the aqueducts, of course, so very famous, very, very beautiful structures and remarkable construction to be able to move water at the proper gradient, the kind of engineering that was required to do that then. And of course, we have now followed that model in many places around the world when we move water from long distances, in some cases from hundreds and even more than 1,000 kilometers in some places on the planet today. And so these have all been very important developments in our human technologies and our societies and in our livelihoods. But I'm going to pause here and tell you a couple stories. I'm going to stay on this slide for just a couple of minutes because in these stories, I think we can understand most of what we need to know about this issue of water scarcity, and also embedded with that will provide the framework for me to then share the ways that I think we need to move forward in order to resolve this problem of water scarcity. So what you're looking at here are the stories from two places. The upper graph is from a river in Australia called the Murray-Darling River, and on the bottom is a river in the southwestern United States called the Colorado River. I could show you thousands of pictures like this from other rivers around the world, and they would tell this same story. And that story is, in the light blue, you see how much water was moving down that river, how much water was available year after year after year. And then the darker blue is the picture of how much of that water we were extracting and consuming and not returning back to the river. The consumptive use of water in that dark blue. Now what you see here over time is that use of the river's water accumulated. It got more and more. We took more and more from the river. And again, we took more and more from the underground aquifers until we reach a point where we have taken all of it. And we start to experience all kinds of problems that we know about today. We experience water shortages. We run out of water to be able to complete our agricultural production. We run out of water to provide drinking water for the cities. We run out of water to be able to run our electric power plants. But long before we got to that point, we were also seeing the signs, the early warning signs. As early as when we started to take maybe only 20% or 30% of that available water, we were starting to have impacts ecologically. We were starting to damage the natural ecosystems. We were starting to see species begin to disappear from these places. By the time we got to 50% or more, and a couple of stories here in the Murray-Darling and the Colorado, we started to see very serious impacts. In the Murray-Darling, we saw the river turn into 1,000 kilometers of toxic blue-green algae. There was no aquatic life that could live in that river. All the small towns that were drawing their water from that river had to shut off the taps because the water was no longer drinkable. In the Colorado River, we saw mass extinctions. We saw 2/3 of all the species, all the fish species living in the river were gone by that point. So we had very, very obvious warning signs. But then we got to the point where we're now experiencing shortages on a frequent and a recurring basis. And this is the story of water scarcity. Again, I could tell you the same story. I could show you the same kinds of data for hundreds or thousands of rivers around the planet. And that's how we get to maps like these. You've seen a couple of versions like this over the course of the last couple of days. The places that are not in a gray color, if they're in the warmer colors, it means that they are exhausting almost all of the available water supply. More than 3/4, in some cases more than 100%, because they're taking underground water that is not being replenished. And so what's happening in these places is perhaps only during very dry times, during droughts, perhaps only during certain months of the year, or many of these places are in the darker colors. All of the time they are using every single drop of water that's available. And when you add this up, when you look at the data from all of these different places around the world, it totals up to 1/3 of all of our rivers and our lakes and our underground aquifers are being largely exhausted, at least temporarily. Tragically, that's already affecting a half of the global population. And one of the things I think is very frightening to many of us that work in the water community is that 3/4 of all the food being grown using irrigation is also dependent upon these places where we're up against the limits of the available water. And so many of the speakers actually over the last couple of days have talked about we have enough data, we have enough talk, we have enough reports, we have enough forecasts. We've heard many, many numbers over the last couple of days. What I'd like to do with the remaining time that I have with you today is to share my thoughts about what we need to do about this. And I'm going to be very simple, I'm going to be very straightforward, I'm going to be very blunt, and I'm going to say that this perspective that I share with you comes from having traveled all around the world over the last 3 decades and seeing many, many different innovations as well as many problems. But what I've come to conclude is that if you don't do these 3 things, you're not going to be able to resolve this problem of water scarcity. First, sustainability is about recognizing that there are limits to the available resources. Yes, they vary from year to year. Yes, we can do some things like build reservoirs to capture some of it or bring in water from other places. But we very much need to come to grips with the fact that it's time to start living within the sustainable limits of the resources that are available to us. We cannot continue to expect that some miracle is going to happen or some technological development is going to save us and make more water for us. We are in a third of the planet up against the limits. Now, I want to be very clear here, and I'm probably going to say it more than once. Establishing limits does not mean stopping growth. It does not mean curtailing the economic development. But it's very, very important to develop a dialogue within your governmental leadership, within your local communities, and come to an understanding about what is the reality, what is the sustainable volume of water that's going to be available to us, so then we can change the conversation and start talking about what are we going to do with what we have going forward, okay? So, one example, I could give you many, fortunately, and I am working on a new book, and I'm going to tell some more of these stories, including South Africa has taken this approach. This is from southeastern Australia. I showed you a graph of the Murray-Darling River Basin there. That's what's pictured here. And again, I show you this graph. So over time, the use of the water got to the point where they were using more and more of the river to the point where they dried up the river eventually. In the recent decades. Now, they started to experience some very, very tragic and very harmful impacts because they were using up all of the water. So they had massive fish kills, where for thousands of river kilometers, the fish all died, all floated to the surface. This river basin is very dependent upon its agricultural economy. They produce most of the food for Australia, and they produce a lot of food that's exported to other countries, particularly to Asia. They had massive losses in the agricultural economy. They had entire herds of sheep and cattle that had to be put down, that they had to kill because they could not grow enough feed to support those animals. This had a massive disruption on their economy, and it caught the attention, of course, of every Australian and all of the political leadership. So this started to happen. This started to get really, really bad as early as the early 1990s. And so the state governments in Australia came together and they said, we have to do something about this. We do not want this to happen to us anymore. And so they put what they called a cap. It's a limit. It's an agreement that says there is a fixed maximum volume of water consumption that we're going to allow within this river basin. And let me back up here. And it was very fortunate that they did the cap at that time because you see what happened. So in the early 1990s, they set that limit. And then in the late 1990s and in the early 2000s, they had the drought of record. They called it the Big Dry. They called it the Millennium Drought. And if they had allowed that trend of increasing water use to continue to rise through the 1990s, things would have been even worse than they actually experienced. The other thing I want to point out about this graph, you see how the water availability and the water use both drop off during the drought. There's been a lot of talk, and we heard these numbers again at this conference, talking about a gap between supply and demand, or that in the future there will be a 40% difference between the water that's available and our demand for water. I don't like hearing those kinds of statistics because, in fact, we cannot drink water that does not exist. There cannot be a gap. That's fiction. When there is no more water available or less water available, you can't do anything other than to reduce your consumption because, again, we can't make water. And so that's a very, very important part here, and we need to be thinking very proactively about, again, what is the sustainable, even though it may vary from year to year, from month to month, what is the sustainable limit? And I will suggest to you that we are at a decision point here, where for these places that are experiencing water scarcity, water shortages all around the planet, we have two choices. We can continue to allow these horrible impacts to recur, and they're going to get worse and worse in the water scarce regions as the climate is changing. Or we can start to act now and do something about this and become much more adaptive to this terrible situation that many of us are living with already and experiencing on a recurring basis, and that we know is going to become more challenging in the future. If we don't get ready now, the future under climate change is going to be much more difficult for us. So, again, the limits, you don't need to understand the numbers here, but basically in Australia, they said we need to reduce our use of this river by 20 to 30%. And they have moved very, very aggressively toward achieving that goal, and they have almost achieved that goal after 10 years of work on it. So the left side just says, the left side is just showing the percentages of water that they want to leave in the river base, or that they were leaving in the river on average. On the right is the amount of water that they want to leave in the river basin going forward. All right, my second point is the issue of what I'm going to call freezing the water footprint. And I would suggest this freeze even means reducing the urban water footprint. It's very, very important for urban residents and political leaders to take the leadership on this. Turns out that in many of the water scarce regions of the world, within the cities of the world, that as much as half of the water that's being consumed is being used outdoors. It's being used to support the landscaping plants. It's being used to support green lawns. It's being used for flower gardens and that sort of thing. And so what we see is that if we can shift away from needing to apply supplemental water, supplying irrigation water outside, we can reduce the water being used in cities by 25 to 50% right off the bat. And so that's what's illustrated here. Australia has been very progressive. Israel similarly. South Africa in many parts is starting to make progress on this as well. There is great opportunity to do this because here's a couple of examples. In the western U.S., an analysis was done. The cities in the western U.S. are using twice as much as Australia. And Australia in every other way looks very, very much like the western United States. We have basically the same climate. And yet the Australian cities are using half the water. That's largely because of the changes that they made in how they use water outside of the home. There's another statistic here that I read in what I was doing research for my visit here. There is potential here in Italy, apparently, as compared to other southern European countries. Spain and France using less water than Italy does. And so it sounds as though there's some potential here in Italy for that. Another reason why I'm optimistic about the potential to be more water conservative in our cities is illustrated by this map. Again, you don't need to see the numbers, you only need to see the bubbles. The bubbles, the bigger the bubble is the bigger the community that's using the local water supply, that the water utility is providing, and the colors reflect how much water those communities are using. What this map says is that there are communities that are using 200 liters of water per person per day, immediately next door to communities that are using 2,000 liters per person per day. A disparity of 10 times. And so we see this in all countries. We see this in all places, that there is great disparities. To talk about averages in some ways is misleading, because what you really have are very, very progressive and water conservative communities and other communities that are not doing a good job on their water use. And so again, this is why I'm optimistic that there's a lot of room for improvement and a lot of opportunity to change this situation. There is, by the way, a lot of work that's being done to develop policies that can be readily adopted by cities, by urban areas, that's called Net Blue. And it's essentially just simply a water offset policy, which says if you're a new development, a new business coming into this area, you need to minimize how much water you're going to need, and then you're going to have to find some way to offset the amount of additional water that you're going to require. How do you do that? How do you offset? Well, you help other people install more efficient toilets and showers and dishwashers, or you help the city to fix some of the leaking pipes that run through the city. There's a number of different ways to do this offset concept. And there is a lot of potential, as we've heard over the last couple of days, for water reuse, water recycling, capturing stormwater, and other ways to get the city's footprint down as low as possible. Here's an example of the fact that by setting limits doesn't mean you have to limit or curtail growth in the economy or even in the population. Over the last 15 years, Los Angeles has been able to increase their population by 19%, but their total water use dropped by 20%. And their mayor, Mayor Garcetti, is very aggressive about that and wants to push harder and harder because he knows the challenges that are coming up in the future. The younger architects and engineers in the room will understand that we are moving toward a completely different approach to building and to architecture and engineering. And we're talking about concepts like net zero within our households, within our commercial buildings, where in fact we can capture the available rainfall, and by recycling it and reusing that water and being very conservative about how the water is used, we can get the needs of this infrastructure, of this architecture, down to a very, very low point, far lower than the numbers that I was talking about a moment ago. All right, my last point, and I'll wrap this up. In the water-scarce regions of the world, about 80 to 85% of all the water that's being consumed, that's being taken from rivers and aquifers and not put back, is going to irrigated agriculture. That's not true in every single water-scarce basin around the world, but it is true for most of them, the vast majority of them. So it's critically important that we figure out how to work with farmers, collaboratively with farmers, incentivizing farmers, enabling farmers to be able to reduce that volume of water that's required to grow the food that all of us need. My group at the University of Virginia in the United States has done a lot of work looking at the ways that farmers can accomplish this. On the first day, we heard some terrific examples from here in Italy with using technology to really understand how much water is needed to produce a crop. We can change the way that we irrigate crops and realize this level of savings. We can be more careful with the way that we treat our soils to restore the organic matter in our soils, to introduce the mulch and different techniques of reducing the amount that we plow the soil and see very substantial water savings as well. And we can decide to change that. We might decide that growing this particular type of crop in this place is no longer a smart thing to do. That we can no longer reliably bring this crop to completion at the end of the year through the irrigation season because there's not enough water to go around. And so in many places of the world, we're starting to think about, should we be shifting from one crop that we've been growing, in some cases for generations, to a different type of crop in order to alleviate that problem. So I want to thank you for your attention. If you want to hear more of these stories, of course, I have told these in my Chasing Water book. But again, I want to thank all of you for the extremely important work that you're doing, and I want to wish your communities and your country all the luck in dealing with this terrible challenge of water scarcity. Thank you.